On the tree-lined King Street in Charleston, South Carolina, nestled among time-worn historic buildings, stood a small pawn shop. A weathered wooden sign hung loosely above the entrance, its hand-carved letters reading Harper's Treasures, so faded that one had to look closely to make them out. A gentle breeze stirred, causing the brass bell on the door to chime softly. A familiar, tender sound, like the heartbeat of memory. Inside, the air held the scent of old wood, faded paper, and the peculiar dust that clings to places where the past is kept alive. Pocket watches rested quietly behind a glass display. A cracked mandolin leaned against a corner wall, and behind the counter, an elderly woman carefully polished a pearl hairpin. Evelyn Harper, 78, was the shop's owner, a fixture of the neighborhood. For more than 40 years, her silver hair was neatly pinned back. Though her eyes had dimmed with age, they still carried a sharp gleam, the gaze of someone who had seen far more than the world assumed a small woman like her ever could. The doorbell rang again. Evelyn looked up. A man stood at the threshold. He wore an old military uniform, his khaki jacket faded, trousers wrinkled, boots coated with a light film of dust. His posture wasn't bent, but his shoulders seemed to carry a weight heavier than any soldier's pack. He stepped inside, each footfall lightly creaking the wooden floor. Evelyn said nothing. She quietly set the hairpin down, removed her reading glasses, and observed him. "Hello, ma'am," he said, his voice low but unsure. I need to sell something." "Take your time," Evelyn replied, her voice as soft as a breath. "What do you have with you today?" The soldier, his name was Dan Carter, approached the counter. Slowly, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in an old handkerchief. His hands were calloused, scratched. As he unfolded the fabric, Evelyn's eyes flickered, just barely. It was a military medal, the kind she seldom saw outside museums or the display cases of veteran families. It was aged, its surface dulled by time, but its shape remained distinct, a silver star with a ribbon striped purple and white. On the back, 3 small letters were engraved, worn but still legible. WCC. Dan placed it on the counter, then looked up at Evelyn. In that moment their eyes met, the gaze of a man clinging to his final hope, and a woman who knew she was about to witness a farewell that would not come easy. "How much for this?" Dan asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though it couldn't hide his inner struggle. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She lifted the medal in both hands, handling it with the care one gives to something not just material, but full of memory and blood. She turned it gently in her palm, letting sunlight from the window glint across the tarnished metal. "Are you sure you want to sell it?" she asked quietly, her eyes never leaving the metal. Dan bit his lip. "I don't have any other choice." His voice dropped. She could hear the dry swallow in his throat. Evelyn placed the medal back on the counter, her fingers still resting lightly on it as if trying to leave behind one last trace of warmth before letting it go. "You served in the military?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. 8 years, 3 deployments," Dan answered, his eyes lowering to the floor. "And this," Evelyn tapped her finger gently on the medal. "It's not yours." Dan gave a slight nod. "It was my grandfather's, William Carter. He was a sergeant in World War II, fought in Normandy, then Belgium. He didn't talk much about the war, just said one thing. It wasn't for the medal, it was for the man beside you." Evelyn felt a pang in her chest. That sentence, she had heard it before, from a young soldier on a night filled with gunfire and flame. "My grandfather was the man I respected most in the world," Dan continued. "When I was a kid, he taught me to fish, taught me how to really listen to people without judging. He's the reason I enlisted." He paused. The air in the shop grew heavier. Evelyn didn't speak. She knew this man needed the space to say something he'd carried far too long. But then, Dan swallowed hard. "I left the service, picked up a few jobs here and there, but nothing steady. Lost my job 3 months ago. Rent's due. Fridge is empty. I I have nothing left to sell but this." Evelyn looked at the young soldier standing before her. Not a failure. A man who had kept his promises until life squeezed him dry. She didn't need to ask further. No need to assess the metal's worth. Because what sat on the counter wasn't just an item. It was a life. A grandfather's, a grandson's, and everything still tethered between them. Evelyn Harper kept her eyes fixed on the metal resting on the counter, as though the layers of dust on its surface were beginning to lift before her eyes. She carefully turned the back of the metal once more, letting the light fall on the hand engraved. W.C.C. William Carter. That name, those initials, she had heard them before, whispered them in her mind thousands of times over the decades. And now it wasn't just a name from the past. It was part of a memory she had buried deep in her heart. She looked at Dan, whose eyes were still lowered as if trying to swallow a nameless shame. But to Evelyn, the man before her wasn't someone selling the past. He was carrying the legacy of a hero. "Did your grandfather ever talk about the war?" Evelyn asked, her voice gentle like the wind weaving through the oak trees outside. Dan shook his head slightly. "Not much. He always said war wasn't something to boast about. That what mattered wasn't who won or lost, but the ones who didn't make it back." A heavy silence settled between them. Evelyn slowly stepped into the room behind the counter, leaving Dan alone in the quiet. He looked around the shop, his gaze resting on the old objects, each one a fragment of someone's life. A dust-covered typewriter, an early model radio, a leather suitcase with a broken handle. Someone had once owned them, had poured hopes, love, or sorrow into them. Now all that remained were silent things. The sound of soft footsteps came from behind the curtain. Evelyn returned holding a small wooden box, its edges worn with age. She placed it on the counter as if passing down something of deep importance. "You need to see this," she said, opening the lid. Inside was an old black and white photograph. The edges were curled. Blotches of yellow stains speckled its surface, like the wounds of time. But the image was still clear. A young girl, Evelyn at 14, stood in the middle of a ruined village, her hair tousled, her wool dress torn at the shoulder. Beside her stood a tall American soldier, upright, with a kind expression. On his uniform, the name tag read, Carter. Dan held his breath, his hand trembled as it touched the photograph. "This is my grandfather," he whispered. Evelyn nodded gently. "Yes. William Carter, your grandfather, saved my life." Her voice, caught as though suppressing a wave of emotion held back for far too long. Her frail hands trembled as they rested on the photo, as if trying to hold on to a sliver of time flowing backward. "It was 1944, Evelyn began. I was just a girl, living with my mother and younger brother in a small village in France not far from Normandy. The Germans were retreating, but they left chaos behind. One night, a few stray soldiers entered the village, and..." She paused, drawing in a deep breath. Dan didn't urge her on. He stood still, as if his heart beat in rhythm with the story, unfolding before him. "We hid in the hayloft behind the barn. I thought I'd never see the light again, but then..." He appeared. Her voice grew softer, as if slipping back into that moment. "William Carter didn't come like a rescuing soldier, but like an older brother. He found me and my little brother trembling in fear. He had no heavy weapons, no unit with him, but he stayed there all night, guarding us. He didn't sleep, didn't take his eyes off the cellar door." Evelyn looked up at Dan. "Your grandfather never left his name, never said anything grand. He only told me, you're going to be okay, your little brother too. Don't be afraid. Anymore." The next morning he left with his unit. I never saw him again." Dan swallowed, his hand still clutching the photograph. In his heart, the image of his familiar grandfather had suddenly come alive like never before. "After the war," Evelyn continued, "my mother brought our family to America. I grew up, built a life, opened this shop. But I never forgot your grandfather's eyes. Those eyes taught me that true kindness doesn't need witnesses. It just needs the right moment." Dan felt his nose sting with emotion. The photo in his hand was no longer just a keepsake. It was a reminder of a legacy he had almost given away. And now, Evelyn softly placed her hand on the medal. You stand here, the blood of the man who saved me. Holding the medal. I once made a vow that if I ever met someone from his family again, I would find a way to repay that kindness. Dan clenched his fist, his eyes reddening. There were no words that could capture everything surging inside him. Pain, regret, and a new flicker of light. Evelyn smiled, not out of joy, but with the peace of finally voicing what she had kept. Sighed for decades. You know, Dan, she said, using his name for the first time. This medal isn't just metal. It's a testament to things that should never be forgotten. Dan nodded faintly, his voice hoarse. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything at all, Evelyn replied, her eyes glowing with kindness. We have time. Let me tell you more about your grandfather, the hero who stepped into my life once and now, through you, has come back. Dan stood frozen, his hands gripping the photograph so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't take his eyes off his grandfather's youthful face, the man he had admired throughout his childhood, now appearing not through second-hand stories, but through the living testimony of someone he had once saved. Evelyn Harper remained behind the counter, her hand resting gently on the medal, as if it were a part of her own heart. On her aged face was the silence of someone who had guarded a memory like a treasure for over 70 years, not for bragging rights, but waiting for the right moment to pass it on. I never thought, Dan began, his voice choked. Never thought Grandpa had saved someone. He never talked about anything. To me, he was just a man who liked black tea and fixing old trucks. Evelyn smiled, a smile steeped in affection. Those who save others. They usually don't talk much about it. They simply live with the memory, and sometimes, those memories find their way back. A soft breeze slipped through, ringing the door chime again, even though no one had entered or left. Dan blinked, as if being pulled back to reality. He looked down at the medal on the counter. It had once been the last thing he ever thought he'd part with, something that represented faith, family, and dignity, and also what he had planned to sell just to afford food and rent. I still need the money, Dan said, almost apologetically. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Instead, she came around the front of the counter. Her slow footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, solemn and steady, as if each step carried a piece of history. She stopped in front of Dan, facing him like a mother facing a child in despair. She didn't look at his wallet, nor did she consider the market value of the medal. Instead, she looked straight into Dan's eyes, tired, worn, but still flickering with a faint light of pride. You can't sell this, Evelyn said, her voice firm, like velvet-wrapped steel. Dan fell silent. I don't have a choice. You always have a choice, she replied, stepping toward the small safe beneath the counter. It's just that sometimes the right choice doesn't come from your wallet. It comes from a promise kept. Evelyn opened the safe and pulled out a thick envelope. It had no name, no note, just a plain white envelope tied with a faded fabric string. She walked back and placed it in front of Dan. Enough to get you through a month, she said. Rent, essentials, a few decent meals. Dan stepped back, stunned. I can't accept this. I can't. It's not for you. Evelyn cut him off. It's for your grandfather. The words stopped Dan in his tracks. Evelyn didn't take back the envelope. She simply looked at him, calm, unwavering, sincere. Your grandfather gave me a second chance at life. That night, if he hadn't come, if he hadn't stayed, I wouldn't be here. There would be no Harper's treasures, no me to tell this story. Dan stared at the envelope like it might burn his hands. His throat tightened. Every coin, every bill inside wasn't pity. It was a debt finally being repaid slowly across 70 years and 3 generations. I don't deserve this, Dan whispered. Evelyn shook her head. You're the grandson of William Carter, the only man I've ever trusted completely during the darkest night of my life. He asked for nothing, Didn't want anyone to know. But I never forgot. Dan felt his chest tighten. The emotions he had buried surged like a flood. He bowed his head, one hand covering his brow, the other still clutching the photograph. Then he let out a soft sob, short but full of unspoken pain, and the tears began to fall quietly. Evelyn said nothing. She simply stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder, light, steady, like his grandfather once had for her, long ago. "You're not alone, Dan," she said softly. "Even when the world turns away, some memories remain. Some kindnesses are never lost. And now, it's my turn to do the right thing." A long moment passed before Dan looked up. His eyes were red, his face lined with hardship, but also lit with something new, a deep gratitude and the sense that he wasn't abandoned. He looked at the envelope, then at the medal. "I almost gave away my grandfather. For money." Evelyn smiled gently. "No, you didn't. You brought him back by coming here." They stood in silence for a while, needing no more words. Then Dan carefully picked up the medal, his hands trembling as though holding it for the first time since the funeral. He placed it in his palm, closed his fingers around it, not to give it away this time, but to keep it, like a renewed vow. "I won't let it leave my hands again," Dan said. Evelyn nodded. "And I won't let you fall into despair again. Not while I can do something about it." Dan clutched the envelope to his chest, as if it were proof of a forgiveness he hadn't dared to ask for. The envelope still lay in Dan Carter's hand like a foreign object, so light, yet carrying the weight of an entire human life. He fumbled with it awkwardly, as if hoping Evelyn would take back what she'd said, tell him to keep the medal and walk away, that all of this had been a fleeting miracle, something unreal. But Evelyn Harper was not someone who said things she didn't mean. She stood in quiet stillness, hands folded before her aged face lined with the creases of time, but her eyes unwavering. They were the eyes of someone who had survived war, who had kindled hope in the darkest places, and now was passing that flame to someone else. Dan slipped the medal into the inner pocket of his coat, his hand still trembling. "I don't know how to thank you enough," Evelyn simply smiled. "You don't have to say anything, Dan. Your presence here is enough." Outside, the late afternoon sunlight slanted through the dust-covered window, bathing the pawn shop in a golden honey glow. The pocket watches shimmered with a faint light, as if bearing witness to a moment that transcended time, when two lives, seemingly unconnected, touched at a single point: gratitude. Dan carefully set the envelope of money down, intending to slide it back toward her. "I still don't feel right accepting this." Evelyn stepped forward, her hand gently pressing his to keep the envelope in place. "Do you know why I opened this shop?" she asked. Dan shook his head, hesitating. "After the war, my mother brought our whole family to America. She passed from cancer not long after. My younger brother suffered psychological trauma. He was never able to live a normal life. And Evelyn exhaled, her gaze drifting into the distance. "I had only one memory that kept me from falling apart: your grandfather's eyes that night." She turned and slowly sat down in the old wooden chair behind the counter. "I never married, never had children. But every item in this shop is a piece of time, a story, a promise left unfinished. I didn't open this place to make money. I opened it to guard memories, waiting for the day someone would come back." Dan felt his throat tighten. "And I'm that person?" Evelyn nodded without hesitation. "You didn't just bring the medal. You brought me a reason to believe that your grandfather lived a life that mattered, that the night he saved me meant something." Dan sat in the chair across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, the envelope still in his hands. He looked around once more. Now, everything in the shop no longer seemed like old stuff. They were living witnesses to lost hopes, forgotten dreams, and acts of kindness never told. "Miss Evelyn," Dan said slowly, "I'm not sure I'm worthy of carrying that legacy. I failed. I lost my job. I almost sold my family's heirloom, which is exactly why you're more worthy than anyone." Evelyn interjected gently but firmly. Those who can still feel pain for their mistakes are the ones who've never truly lost themselves. Dan lowered his head, both hands covering his face. When I came here, I thought if I couldn't sell it, I'd just sleep in my car until the gas ran out. Evelyn stood up and walked to a small cabinet near the front door. She opened a drawer, pulled out an old key ring and a business card. "Do you have identification?" she asked. Dan looked up, puzzled. "Yes, in my wallet." "Then take it with you, and take this." She handed him the business card. On the back, written in purple ink, "Room 2B, second floor, above the old bookstore. 3 weeks rent paid." Dan's eyes widened. You're... There's a small apartment upstairs. I've kept it for travelers, strangers, or sometimes for those who need a roof over their head. I don't live there anymore. But I clean it every month." He stepped back as if not believing what he was hearing. "You can't do this. You're William Carter's grandson, a soldier, someone who needs a fresh start. Don't reject kindness just because you think you don't deserve it. That's how the world loses the people who need love the most." The room was silent. Then Dan took the key. He clenched it in, his palm feeling the cold metal, but also a strange, steadying warmth, as if everything today wasn't just coincidence. "Miss Evelyn, I won't let you down." Evelyn smiled, her eyes misty but shining with light. "You haven't let me down. Not since the moment you walked through that door." Dan Carter stepped out of Harper's Treasures, his hand clutching the envelope and the old key. As the glass door closed behind him, the brass bell chimed one last time, ringing out like a farewell, or perhaps a silent blessing sent into the air. Charleston that evening was breathtakingly beautiful. Golden sunlight bathed the cobblestones of the sidewalk, casting a warm glow that made everything seem wrapped in a gentle nostalgia. Dan stood still for a moment in front of the shop, breathing in the briny air drifting in from the Ashley River, carrying with it the scent of the sea and whispers of days long gone. For the first time in months, he felt like he could truly exhale. The silver medal now rested inside his inner coat pocket, right where his heart was pounding. It was no longer a burden, but a reminder that in life, strength didn't always mean never falling. It meant rising, even when you thought you had nothing left. Dan slowly walked along the street, his hand tightening around the key. The second-floor apartment, Evelyn had said so. Just a small place, enough to start over. Enough to live gently, with himself. He felt as if someone was walking beside him. Not Evelyn, but his grandfather, William Bill Carter, the man he once believed he had failed. But no. Dan knew in his heart that if his grandfather were here, he would place a hand on his shoulder and say, "You did the right thing, Danny. Starting over is never failure. It's courage." Inside the pawn shop, Evelyn Harper sat quietly behind the counter, her eyes still watching the door as if she could see beyond the glass, past the streets, following the footsteps of the soldier's grandson who had once saved her. She gently placed the wooden box holding the old photo back into the drawer, softly smoothing the surface of the paper. Her hands trembled slightly, but her heart felt silently at peace. "You see that, Bill?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Your grandson didn't let you down." A single tear dropped onto the counter, not from pain, but because a circle of memory had finally closed. Evelyn felt something in her chest awaken. For 70 years, she had carried a spiritual debt, living her life in honor of the chance she'd been given on that dark night, and now she had paid it back, not with money but with meaning. With the knowledge that he hadn't just saved a little girl, but had passed down a quiet legacy of kindness to the next generation. Upstairs in a modest building just steps away from the pawn shop, Dan unlocked the door to room 2B. The apartment was small and simple. A single bed, a chipped wooden desk, a window looking out over the rooftops across the street. To someone else, it might mean very little. But to Dan, it was the first real shelter he'd had in months. After sleeping in his car, eating instant noodles, and sometimes skipping meals entirely. He placed the envelope on the table, removed his shoes, and sat down at the edge of the bed. Every fiber in his body seemed to loosen, as if it had finally been given permission to rest. Dan pulled out the medal again. He turned it over. WCC. William Charles Carter. He reached out and gently touched those initials, then placed the medal against his chest and closed his eyes. In the room's fading light, memories came rushing back. His grandfather by the fire, the smell of bacon grease in a cast-iron pan, stories about fixing engines, lessons on tying knots, and on how to be a man not by muscle, but by keeping your word. "Hope you're proud of me, Grandpa," Dan whispered. That evening, Evelyn lit a small candle beside the old photograph, the one of young Evelyn and William Carter. She sat alone as her tiny radio played an old jazz tune from the 1940s. No lyrics, just the soft, lingering notes of memory. Some lives cross paths in a single moment. Some people carry each other for a lifetime, even if they met only once. And some debts are not meant to be repaid with money, but with loyalty, with compassion, and with passing hope to someone else, exactly when they need it most. A few weeks later, Dan Carter started a new job, helping out at a small auto repair shop on the city's south side. The owner was an old veteran. When he saw the medal in Dan's coat, he simply nodded and said nothing. No one needed to know the details. What mattered was that Dan had arrived at the right time and that he was starting over, quietly, decently. Room. Doobie now had a new photo on the wall. Dan standing at his grandfather's grave, holding the medal, a calm smile on his face. Beneath the photo, in Evelyn's handwriting, were these words: "Some medals are not meant to be displayed. They're meant to be carried, in silence, in dignity, and in love." And so, the story that began with a weary step into a pawn shop did not end with a sale, but with something far more sacred, the passing on of compassion and a quiet message that sometimes the only thing we truly need is for someone to believe we're worthy of starting again. And so concludes the story of Dan Carter and Evelyn Harper, a journey that connected two generations through gratitude, wartime memories, and quiet humanity. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to support us in continuing to tell simple yet profound stories, where kindness still has the power to heal the wounds of time. See you on the next journey.